The photographs landed on the kitchen island like small detonations, each one a bright rectangle that rewrote the room in an instant. In less than a minute, the man who had pressed his forehead to hers at dawn looked at her as if he were seeing a stranger. My name is Claire Bennett, and today I will tell you how a stack of images, a hotel receipt, and a forged signature almost stole everything I had built with the man I once trusted with my life. If you think truth finds a way, type "I believe" in the comments now. Stay with me, because what seemed like a private betrayal would become a public unraveling, and the person everyone expected to defend me would be the one who turned the knife. It was a Tuesday evening, late summer, when Margaret Voss set an aged leather folder down with a practiced, ceremonial calm. The house smelled of lemon oil from the kitchen and of Ethan's cologne on his coat that hung by the door, a clean, woody scent that always made Claire want to breathe slower. Light from the pendant lamp washed the marble in a soft gold. Margaret opened the folder, and the pages whispered like a judge's robe. Inside were color prints, close-ups of a woman in a coat Claire owned, a crumpled receipt from a boutique hotel, and a copy of what at first glance looked like Claire's cursive on a confirmation form. The paper felt cold and glossy under Claire's fingers. She ran her thumb over the edge of a photograph and tasted a sudden metallic sharpness on her tongue, the taste of panic. Ethan lifted his eyes slowly, the way people do when they are trying to reconcile someone else's evidence with their own memory. In the pause, the refrigerator hummed, a small domestic metronome that suddenly sounded enormous. The click of a fork fell like a clock striking. "Explain this," he said, and his voice was a flat instrument, precise, as if he were reading from a script someone else had written for him. Behind him, Margaret smiled with the flatness of someone who had rehearsed victory. "I asked Gavin at the concierge," she said. "He remembers taking the reservation. He remembers the card." The name floated in the air, the hotel manager, Gavin Rousseau, who ran the Grand Mariner where Ethan and Claire had spent anniversaries. The scene smelled of lemon, paper, and the faint ghost of Ethan's cologne, and Claire felt as if she were watching from the other side of glass. This is the question that would haunt the next months. Why don't you want her anymore? And his answer, when it finally came, would be quieter, colder, and more shocking than anyone expected. Now, let us go back to the day before those photographs appeared. Claire had not always lived within glass towers and curated charity events. She grew up in a narrow row house 2 towns over, with a front yard that smelled of tomatoes and basil in summer, and with a mother who ironed linens at night to make ends meet. As a child, Claire learned to measure worth by grades and by late-night pages of library books. She earned a scholarship to a state university where she studied graphic design with an obsession that smelled of ink and coffee. Her first job was at a small print shop owned by Mr. Alvarez, a widower who taught her how to fix a press and how to greet customers with calm. She moved to the city to work at an advertising firm and met Rosa, who would become her best friend and emergency contact. At 29, exhausted but proud, she had a modest apartment above a bakery, and the mornings tasted of yeast and sugar. The turning point came when she designed a campaign for a philanthropic gala, and Ethan Voss noticed it. He was kind at first, generous in subtle ways, bringing books that smelled of new paper, listening to stories of her childhood as if they were maps. When they married, it felt improbable and steady all at once, like a bridge built in secret. Money did not change her bedrock habits immediately. She still reached for margarine instead of butter, still called her mother every Sunday, still slept with the exact same blanket she had since college. But new layers appeared: staff, events, foundations, and a house on the water that thrummed with other people's needs. She loved the rhythm of building things, of designing programs for Ethan's foundation, and putting her own name on small grants to community arts groups. The roots of the woman she was remained, but they stretched into landscaped soil that required different hands to tend, and sometimes she woke up with the taste of luxury in her mouth and the memory of basil in her throat, and could not name which life belonged to which self. Margaret Voss was not born into the quiet certainties Claire remembered. She had grown up in a town of glass factories with a father who kept 2 ledgers and a temper. As a young woman, she moved up into high school politics,
and then into a life of commerce, marrying twice before she met Ethan's father, who taught her how to speak sharply and how to accept power as if it were oxygen. She had an eye for arrangement and a talent for persuasion that smelled faintly of varnish and old wood. Her backstory was a series of careful escalations, a string of negotiated opportunities that left her with contacts at hotels, real estate, and a network of social architects. When Ethan began to falter in attention, she stepped in with the efficient blandness of someone who believed that relationships were projects to be managed. Her resources included a PR consultant named Ava Collins and a lawyer friend, Daniel Park, who could make facts bend along hoped outcomes. Margaret never believed in messes remaining small. She prepared antiseptic plans and controlled narratives as if rehearsing a play. Deep down, she had a fear that talent without structure decayed, and she had learned early that the best way to avoid ruin was to preempt it. Her life smelled of polished wood and strong tea, and she had perfected the soft cruelty of arranging other people's disasters so they would become lessons in order. She always thought herself a guardian, even when her guardianship looked like a trap. The first big confrontation followed, a scene that would be replayed on phones and whispered about under breath at charity luncheons. It began with a text message that arrived while Claire was packing a tote bag for a board meeting. The phone vibrated against leather, a quick rattle that felt like a small animal. The message read, "Anonymous," a single sentence, and a link. She clicked, expecting some cruel rumor, and saw the first photograph. The woman's coat was familiar, the posture intimate. Heat rushed to Claire's face and then left her, leaving a cold like ocean water. She called Ethan, her thumb tracing the glass as if it could summon him closer. He answered with a clipped tone, explaining he was at a foundation event, that he would be home late. His voice was steady and distant. "Someone is trying to make you look bad," Claire said. "There are real photos." He paused. In that pause, the air in the upscale kitchen grew dense, like humidity before a storm. The conversation that followed between them expanded into a sequence of 10 exchanges, each one carrying weight. "Send them to me," Ethan said. "I just did," Claire replied, fingers trembling. "I will have someone look into this tonight," he promised. "Do you believe me?" she asked. "Of course," he said, a fractional break in the syllable. "But you sounded different," Claire said, the word different tasting like iron. "I am tired, Claire," he said. "You know how busy this week was." "I did not sleep. I am asking you to see me," she said. "I will be there in an hour," he answered. "Please," she said. "I am on my way," he said finally, and the line clicked like a small hinge. The kitchen smelled of lemon and fear. When he arrived, he took the folder from Margaret, and his hands left a ring of warmth on the leather. He looked at the photos and at the receipt, and for a moment his expression folded into confusion. Then Margaret began to explain details with the relentless calm of someone reading minutes, and Ethan's face hardened, as if he were replacing one face with another. The first accusation had already been planted as a seed in a crowd of witnesses, and the crowd was Margaret, Lena his sister, Ava the PR manager, Rosa who had come to help Claire, and Mr. Alvarez who had been called in as moral support. The voices braided into an accusing chorus.
"We only want the truth," Lena said, her voice even but cutting. "We do not want scandal." Each sentence felt measured. Emma the housekeeper stood behind a doorway, hands clasped, eyes wide. The photograph of the woman had her coat collar up, a hand on the doorknob of a suite at the Grand Mariner. The receipt bore a time that coincided, at least on paper, with a dinner Claire had not attended. A signature leaned across the bottom in quick, confident loops that looked at first glance like her own. In the center of the second scene, dialogue expanded into a sequence of 12 exchanges, a necessary expansion because this moment would be remembered for its multiplicity of accusations and denials.
"This was a surprise booked for you," Margaret said, folding her hands. "Ethan planned it, did he not?" "No," Claire said, the denial coming out a fragile reed. "He never told me about anything." "Then why is your name on this form?" Lena demanded. "How do you not remember signing for a reservation?" "I did not sign it," Claire answered. "I knew nothing." "Maybe Ethan forgot to tell you," Ava suggested, trying to keep a professional veneer. "Sometimes plans are done last minute." "This is a fabricated narrative," Claire said, heat returning to her mouth. "Someone used my coat in those images. Someone used our details." The room smelled suddenly of coffee and metal, like a hospital waiting room. "We will confirm with the hotel," Daniel Park said, his voice low and legal. "We will get the electronic records." The topic of electronic records introduced a technical glance in the conversation, and Ava pulled out her phone, as if the world could be rewound with a swipe. The accordion of conversation stretched, 10, then 12 back and forths, each one a smaller fracture in trust. After that evening, Claire left the house before midnight carrying a duffel bag and a head full of questions. Appearing suddenly in the foyer, the scene of her leaving smelled of lemon oil, of ticked-off engines, and of the faint sweetness of the bakery downstairs that she had once walked past. She moved into a small studio on the other side of town, a place with a single window that opened onto a fire escape. The space smelled of paint, of old coffee, and of the city at night. The exodus felt like exile because it was not only a physical move but a public positioning. News of their argument had seeped into invitation lists and then into gossip chains. Claire found herself losing access to staff, to chauffeurs, to the steady hum that had made their life feel ordinary. Payments were paused, and her name was suddenly a topic at board tables. She struggled with logistics, learning how to manage a small account, how to write pitches in late hours, her hands rebelling at the keys that now produced spreadsheets instead of pitch layouts. She kept a small box of personal items: her grandmother's watch, a chipped blue mug, and a necklace with a simple pendant she had worn since college. At night she would touch the pendant until the metal warmed, an anchor to a self that still remembered basil, library pages, and Mr. Alvarez's easy advice. The fall was loud and private. At a community center where she offered graphic workshops, Claire found herself answering questions from neighbors like Lena the florist and a local baker named Sam who had once catered one of her smaller events. They watched with curiosity and tenderness. "She does not deserve this," Lena the florist whispered when Claire packed supplies after a class, her hands always smelling of stems and soil. The fall had a soundtrack. The clack of heels at board meetings where chairs she once sat in were suddenly filled by others, the soft ping of press releases that rearranged her public image. She tried to apply for a freelance design contract with a small nonprofit run by Rose's cousin, but the email response was careful. "We cannot risk association," it read, a sterile phrase that peeled away her sense of belonging. Money was no longer immediate, and she found herself counting receipts, buying vegetables instead of prepared meals, avoiding calls from a PR person who wanted her to handle the narrative. The hardship was not only material, it was a feeling of being suspended. She learned to cook rice without a rice cooker, to patch a hole in a blouse, to sleep without the muted background of a house staff. Her first steps toward rebuilding were small and granular, beginning with early mornings opening a pop-up design studio in a shared workspace. She started as a contractor for a local gallery, creating promotional materials that smelled of ink and glue. The work was physically demanding, but it made sense in the way breathing does. Her fingers found their old rhythm, and the tactile pleasure of measuring margins returned. She took a part-time job at a boutique marketing firm where a manager named Daniel hired her because he liked her portfolio and because of a personal history he respected. The office smelled of printers and brewed tea. Her days filled with design briefs, coffee rings on documents, and the satisfaction of hitting delivery dates. Claire learned to invoice properly, to keep receipts, and to answer client emails with a calm voice that hid her inner uncertainty. She kept a ledger in a small notebook, writing down every payment and every small victory like a quiet liturgy. This first professional return was modest, almost ritual in its repetition, but it mattered more than any gala applause. The early victories accumulated. A local nonprofit asked Claire to redesign a campaign for literacy, and the launch went well. The tactile joy of watching posters wrapped around lampposts, the smell of fresh paper at the printers, and the small televised clip that mentioned her name were all small combustions of affirmation. People began
To call her work resilient, to mention that she had reclaimed her voice. She met a new friend at the studio, Mason Reed, a private investigator who had retired from law enforcement. He smelled of old leather, coffee, and stories. He offered to look into the photos quietly for a modest fee, and Claire, wary but hopeful, accepted. Mason spoke plainly about processes, about how cameras could be manipulated, how receipts could be created, and how signatures could be forged. He explained semi-technical steps, checking hotel surveillance footage, asking for card imprint records, matching ink through basic forensic checks, and pulling timestamps from booking systems. The explanation was clear and accessible, a brief mapping of procedure that made the chaos feel methodical. He told her it would take time, and that some things would require patience more than headline making. News traveled quickly, and a secondary role in her narrative emerged when Ethan appeared with a new presence on his arm at a charity lunch. The tabloids pounced. Photos of a woman dining with him in a public place accompanied speculative captions. The woman was called Isabel by some outlets, and the image of them smiling was like a headline cut from polished metal. Claire felt the planet of her life shift. The compound of their shared routines fractured into a public spectacle. Reactions from friends were immediate and named. Lena, who texted condolences and then went silent. Rosa, who called with practical offers of help. Mr. Alvarez, who sent a package with homemade bread. Gavin, the hotel manager, who declined to comment. Sam, the baker, who sent cupcakes with a note that read, "Hang on." The social world rearranged itself and named roles, like witnesses, sympathizers, and cautious allies. Ethan's new relationship was a provocation, a stinging public performance that made private pain visible in a way Claire had not consented to. The first direct reconnection with Ethan happened unexpectedly at a gallery opening, where Claire had installed work. She arrived early to set up, her fingers smelling of paint and glue, and found the same place buzzing with small conversations. He appeared near the sculpture wing, the room's light catching on the cufflinks he only wore at particular events. The confrontation required a carefully written sequence of 10 exchanges that would have the weight of legal testimony, not because of their words, but because of their silences. "Claire," he said, stepping close, "I did not want this to become media." "You did not stop it either," she answered. "You let them decide." "There were things happening you did not know about," he said, looking down at a catalog. "You trusted me, and I did not want to betray you." "You did not have to defend me," she said. "You did not have to choose silence over truth." "I thought I was protecting you from worse," he said. "I thought the less we said, the less damage there would be." "Protection that sacrifices the person it claims to?" "Protect is not protection," Claire said. "It is exile." "I am sorry," he said, the word coming out like a small offering. "But sorry is not enough." He walked away, the room's sound reordering itself around the distance he left. The exchange contained no flourish, only the mechanical facts of regret and absence. Meanwhile, momentum gathered for a public investigation. Mason produced a set of leads and handed them to Claire like a dry bundle of wire. He requested access to the hotel's CCTV for the day of the supposed reservation, asked for card imprint machine records, and subpoenaed email confirmations if necessary. He also sent photos to a forensic document examiner who checked ink density and pen pressure on the alleged signature. The explanation he provided for Claire and for the wider audience, summed up in practical terms, was concise. Surveillance footage could show whether the woman in the photos was present in the lobby at the stated time. The hotel could produce digital logs of who used a room key based on electronic key system timestamps.
Card imprint devices left traceable marks, and merchant receipts included reference numbers. And forensic document analysis could compare micro-characteristics of handwriting to detect forgeries. This technical summary helped translate the chaos into a plan, and it took 3 weeks to begin producing tangible results. Because the hotel delayed, citing privacy concerns and corporate policy, and because data retrieval from legacy systems required time-stamped requests and formal legal pathways. As evidence arrived, patterns emerged. The CCTV from the hotel lobby showed a woman with a similar coat but with a different gait, a distinct limp on her right leg that the woman in the photos did not have. The lobby footage timestamps were inconsistent with the time printed on the receipt. Card imprint data suggested the merchant record had been created on a different terminal than the one shown in the hotel's internal documents. The forensic document examiner found significant differences in pen pressure and stroke angle between Claire's known signatures and the alleged booking confirmation. Mason traced a payment trail to an intermediary company that had links to a booking service used by high-net-worth households. It was a small but crucial irregularity that smelled like an attempt to build a plausible fiction. The revelations had the slow-blooming effect of a truth that would not explode but would seep into a system and leave stains of its own. The public campaign of apology and reclamation began with Ethan's first official statement, a clipped message released through Ava Collins that thanked the press for their patience and asked for privacy. The statement was insufficient for many, and so he followed with actions that looked like an attempt at reconstruction. He visited charities together with Claire in public spaces, photos caught them speaking into microphones, and he posted a photograph of the two of them on social media with a caption about shared history and difficult times. He sent flowers to Claire's small studio with a note that read, "I am sorry," yet never explicitly stated what he was sorry for. It was a campaign of half apologies and careful gestures, an attempt to manage reputation without dismantling the narrative that had been set in motion. The public reacted with a mixture of sympathy and suspicion. Some donors called to ask about continuity, some columnists declared the case ambiguous, while online threads speculated about power plays and whether Claire was being gaslit. Moments of tension multiplied, and I will describe 3 that stand out with length and detail because they were fulcrums for decisions. The first happened a month after the photos surfaced when Claire received a printed stack of bank transfer records that contradicted what Margaret had portrayed as proof of Claire's impropriety. Claire sat alone in her tiny kitchen, the light above the sink humming, and read line after line of entries that did not belong to her. The sound of the refrigerator was a thin neighborly noise. She felt every paper edge prick her fingers, the ink smell bright and chemical. Her mind looped through memory, trying to match a payment to a memory. She realized she had been used as a cover, a scapegoat. She called Mason, and his voice on the other end came soft and raw with authority. He said, "We have a thread." That evening, she slept for 2 hours and then woke with the clean resolve of someone who had been stripped and refused to be left bare. The pain was deep, and it tasted like pennies in the mouth, but also like a seed that might become something else. The second moment of acute tension came when Lena confronted Margaret at a family brunch, a scene with the sound of silverware and laughter that turned brittle. The air in the room smelled of roasted coffee and orange marmalade. Lena's accusations spilled, her voice betrayed by a tremor. "You should have told him to check first," she demanded, hands curled around a coffee cup. "You gave us a story." Margaret, always composed, answered in measured tones about preservation of family honor, and her defense felt like varnish layered over an old crack. The argument spilled into forced smiles and strained small talk, the rest of the table pretending not to listen. The tension in the room was tactile, napkins twisted under fingers, a ring scraped the table. Lena finally said, "You weaponized her life," and the phrase landed like a verdict. The hush that followed was wide and sharp. People who had been standing at the edges of the conversation looked away, some with guilt, some with relief. The event marked a fracture within the family that no carefully prepared statement could stitch back. The third tension point arrived at the hospital when Ethan had a health scare, an arrhythmia that called forth doctors and monitors with the sterile scent of disinfectant. Claire learned of it through a call from Emma, the housekeeper who had stayed loyal enough to inform her. She arrived to find Ethan pale and vulnerable, hooked up to a tangle of wires, a beeping monitor marking the staccato rhythm of life. In that cold room with fluorescent light that flattened shadows, Claire and Ethan spoke in a spare exchange that required close attention because the stakes were intimacy and truth. He asked why she had come, and she said because this was still our life. He said he did not want to pull her back into the mess. She said she was already in it whether he acknowledged it or not. A cardiologist named Dr. Patel explained treatments in a low, clear voice about rhythms and pills and monitoring, and the medical words grounded the scene in a clinical reality that felt brutally human. The episode produced a choice point for Claire. She could use this vulnerability to ask for accountability, or she could let it wash over them both as an event that reset boundaries. She chose to be present, but also to insist on clarity. The beeping in the background was a metronome for the decisions that followed. As the case developed, public sympathy shifted. The hotel issued a formal correction that acknowledged errors in their public-facing summary of events and agreed to hand over original digital logs to an independent auditor. The auditor's preliminary report noted discrepancies in timestamps and raised questions about a staff member who had access to internal booking tools and who had a personal connection to a third party engaged in reputation management. The document smelled of photocopy toner and cold ink, official and brittle. Mason traced communications between the intermediary company and a small agency known to take on reputation salvage operations. The trail led to a woman named Isabel who turned out to be a hired actor, a fact that by itself was not scandalous, but, when combined with the forged signature and manufactured receipt, revealed an orchestrated attempt to manufacture evidence. Publicly, Margaret's position crumbled with a kind of slow inevitability that still had moments of surprise. After the auditor's findings, Ethan faced a choice point presented in a long public exchange between him and his board. The board asked for a clarification of his role in the early containment efforts, for an accounting of who had been contacted, and whether any resources of the foundation had been used in ways that breached policy. He answered with a speech that blended apology and deflection, acknowledging poor judgment in allowing family dynamics to shape token responses. The revelation that the intermediary company's invoices matched payments from an account Margaret controlled complicated matters. The moral texture of the story shifted. It was no longer simply about a misinterpreted photograph, but about the deliberate use of resources to create a false narrative. Legal consequences followed. Formal complaints were lodged, civil processes began, and journalists began to pronounce names that until then had been merely whispers. The trial of reputation was messy. Of verification and to talk about the danger of manufactured narratives. Their talk was candid, and the hall smelled of coffee and old wood, the crowd listening with a mix of sympathy and curiosity. They launched a small fund in Claire's name for investigative journalism grants, a symbolic and practical step that both acknowledged wrong and invested in public accountability. Ethan donated to organizations that helped people whose reputations had been harmed, and Claire spoke at a community center about power imbalances and the need for procedural fairness. The public appreciated the gestures, and slowly, reputational capital returned in small increments. There were moments, small and private, where they tested the possibility of coming back together. At home, Claire would find Ethan waiting with a cup of tea, the house smelling faintly of lemon and warmth. They would sit and practice active listening, asking questions without leading, naming feelings without accusation. In a long, quiet conversation that ran closer to 10 exchanges, they worked through the scene where Ethan had not defended her. "Why did you not ask more questions?" she asked, voice steady. "I thought I was protecting you," he replied. "Protecting me by letting me suffer? That felt like abandonment," she said. "I was afraid of making things worse," he answered. "You made a choice not to stand beside me publicly," she said. "I was wrong," he replied. "I will not make that same choice again," he said. The pledge was small but meaningful. Trust was not restored overnight, but a system of accountability was established. The epilogue must be precise and dated, because reconstruction requires time and measurable outcomes. 1 month after the hotel correction, Claire had moved back into a modest apartment closer to the studio, her days full of client work and evenings teaching design workshops at a community college. She had retained independent counsel for any future disputes and had started a small microgrant program for young designers in partnership with Rosa and Mr. Alvarez, whose name appeared on the program website as an honorary mentor. She reported feeling steadier, and she wrote letters to donors to clarify the timeline of events in her own words. The public reaction was cautiously supportive, and a few old friends reached out to reconnect. She still kept the blue pendant in a drawer, but she wore it sometimes, letting it warm against her skin as a private ritual. 3 months later, the independent audit of the foundation had been completed, and presented with recommendations for governance changes. The audit noted failures in internal communication and the risk of familial influence on foundation practices. Margaret had stepped down from several advisory roles, and Ethan had accepted board oversight and agreed to a transparency plan. Claire had been invited to join the independent oversight committee and used her voice to advocate for stricter vendor vetting and for a whistleblower mechanism. The microgrant program in her name had awarded its first round of recipients, and Claire spoke at a small
ceremony where her message focused on resilience, process, and the importance of concrete safeguards. The community responded with donations and offers to collaborate. 6 months later, the landscape was altered, but not undone. Legal settlements had been reached with the intermediary companies, and a small sum was allocated to a trust that funded community investigative courses. Ethan and Claire had attended therapy consistently, reporting improved communication and establishing external mediators for family interactions. Claire had launched a modest design collective and had taken on pro bono work for organizations helping people affected by false accusations. She gave a talk at a local college about reputational harm and the ethics of power. Her voice had changed. It was steadier and sometimes soft with a tenderness that used to frighten her. The couple had not reclaimed the same ease they once had, but they had constructed a new foundation built on rules, public transparency, and charitable efforts that reflected accountability. There remained scars, internal and public, but they had become part of a history that Claire did not let define her. She had turned her pain into tools for others, a thing that felt like both defiance and repair. If you have read this far and felt the weight of the story, remember to write, "I believe," if you believe in truth finding its way. Share your experiences in the comments. Start with "I saw" or "I am," and tell one sentence about an injustice you witnessed or experienced. Your words help others feel less alone. If this story moved you and you want more, subscribe to the channel for weekly narratives that focus on injustice, investigation, and reconstruction. There is no neat, happy ending in every life, but there is a path forward that can be built with accountability, therapy, and clear public commitments. The last image I want to leave you with is small and vivid. A photo of a blue pendant resting on a wooden table, sunlight catching its edge, and a piece of paper beside it that reads, "Truth Matters." Remember that trust is not a commodity that can be spent without accounting, and that sometimes the bravest act is to return, with conditions, to what you once loved.